Welcome to the deep dive. Really glad you could join us today. We're exploring something pretty critical of the future of Iran and, the ongoing push for freedom there. Our focus is this really compelling interview with Mohammad Gharaee. He's a writer, political activist. It aired on Radio Irava, July 6, 2025. So our mission for this deep dive, we want to unpack a concept the source talks about a lot, the third solution for Iran. We'll also try to get a handle on how this source sees what the Iranian people genuinely want and look at its take on different figures, different movements. It's a complex picture. And finally, assess what the source says about the foundation of the Iranian resistance itself, all through the lens of Mr. Garae's interview.
Exactly. And it's timely stuff from Mr. Gharaee. He recently published an article, The Irreversible Path of Freedom, Neither Monarchy nor Vilayat, Yes to Iranian Resistance. Just for clarity, Vilayat here refers to Vilayat Faqih, the guardianship of the jurist. That's the ruling principle of the current regime. So yeah, throughout this deep dive, we'll tackle some key questions he raises, like how do you figure out what people really demand? What's the messaging, according to this source, behind Reza Pahlavi's recent moves? And what about the resistance? What's their social base? What democratic guarantees do they claim to offer?
Yeah.
It's definitely one specific, quite sharp perspective on things.
Okay, so if we really want to understand this source's viewpoint on Iran's future, we have to start with its core idea, the third solution. It's getting talked about more now, it seems. But it's worth noting the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the NCRI, they've pushed this for decades. Maryam Rajavi, for instance, brought it up again recently in the European Parliament. And that was, during that tense time after an Israeli attack on Iran. So what is this third solution really? What does the source say it signifies?
Well, what's interesting about the third solution as the source lays it out, it's not just about what it says no to. It really redefines who has the agency, who gets to make the change happen. It's absolutely central to the political thinking of Maryam Rajavi, the MEK, that's the People's Mojahedin Organization of Iran, and the whole NCRI. The core idea is simple, really. Only the Iranian people, through their own organized resistance, can bring about real lasting change. So that means it flat out rejects two other paths people talk about, appeasement and foreign military intervention. Neither are seen as viable ways to oust the regime.
Okay, so it rejects those two. Does
Yeah.
the source explain why? What's the critique?
Oh, absolutely. It offers a pretty strong critique of both. Let's take appeasement first. The argument in the source is that sticking with appeasement, even if it seems to be showing, quote, cracks, well, it just leads to more problems. Specifically, expansion of terrorism, warmongering in the region, and widespread human rights violations. That's how the source puts it. And it gives examples, like this recent thing in Sweden. The regime apparently trying to train underage individuals, the source calls them refugees and hooligans, using drones for attacks. Then there was an arrest in Denmark, similar stuff, reconnaissance in Germany. And 13 arrests in the U.S., some supposedly involving IRGC members, the Revolutionary Guard. The source even brings up a warning from Maryam Rajavi, like 21 years ago in the European Parliament, saying that if the West had listened back then, maybe current conflicts could have been avoided. She apparently stated that the danger of fundamentalism and extremism is 100 times worse than an atomic bomb. Quite a stark warning.
Wow, yeah. Okay, so that's appeasement. What about the other rejected path for foreign military intervention?
Right. On that front, the source is pretty clear. Regimes are never overthrown by war and bombs from the sky. It points to the recent flare-up between the mullahs and Israel. And also historical cases, Afghanistan, Iraq, where ground troops were needed to actually change things on the ground. And here's the crucial point the source makes. No major power seems willing to send ground troops into Iran. So if you follow that logic, the conclusion from this perspective is that the regime change, when it happens, has to come from within, from the Iranian people and the Iranian resistance.
Okay, so the source is saying outside forces won't work, appeasement is harmful, which really brings us back to the Iranian people themselves. But how does the source claim to know what they actually want? I mean, that's always the challenge, right? So many different voices, so many claims. How does this interview suggest we cut through the noise?
That's a fair question. The source suggests, well, it uses this metaphor. If observers would just take off their glasses, meaning the appeasement viewpoint, they'd see the reality on the ground much more clearly. The daily struggles, it gives a really harrowing example. This recent regime attack on Ghanek village in Sistan and Baluchistan. A woman was killed, others wounded by armed forces. And this led Maryam Rajavi to say, quote, the heroic, free women of Iran will one day strike the final blow to these mullahs.
So it's about looking at events on the ground. What other evidence does the source point to?
It points to quite a few things to seize as clear evidence. First, the popular slogans you hear, things like death to the dictator, death to Khamenei, and crucially, after 2017, this widespread chant, Reformists, hardliners, the game is over. And also that other revealing one. Our enemy is right here, they lie when they say it's America. That's pretty direct. Then there are the election boycotts. The source mentions official turnout figures around 40% for the 2021 and 2023 elections, but the resistance claims the non-participation rate was over 90%, a huge gap. You also see widespread protests, more strikes, more demonstrations across society, teachers, workers, retirees, nurses, farmers, students. And the source says they're consistently demanding fundamental change, an end to corruption, and overthrowing the regime. And the cost. The source highlights the human cost. It reports 4,000 people killed during the 2022 protests alone. The regime admitted over 1,000 arrests then, and 1,500 killed back in November 2019. It notes over 100,000 martyred by the regime over the decades. These numbers, as the source presents them, really underscore the intensity,
Right, the intensity of the demands as the source sees it. It paints a very stark picture.
Yeah.
So, given these claims about the people's will, how does the resistance itself translate that into a plan, a practical vision for Iran's future? Does the source outline a roadmap?
It does, yeah. That leads us to what the source calls Maryam Ravi's 10-point plan for transition. The source describes it as the resistance's manifesto, and even one of the most complete manifestos of alternatives in the world. High praise in the source material.
Yeah.
And it is pretty comprehensive. It's designed for a democratic society, and the source presents its principles as really urgent for Iran right now. Want me to quickly run through the main points as the source details?
Yeah, please do. What are the key principles?
Okay, so first, freedom of expression, parties, assembly, press all free. Second, free elections, universal suffrage, power based on the people's vote, popular sovereignty. Third, separation of religion and state, secularism. Fourth, full gender equality everywhere. And it specifically mentions the MEK as what it calls a positive hijme for women internally, like giving women preferential roles to push equality forward. Fifth, an independent judiciary and abolishing the death penalty. The source mentions Mrs. Rahavi's dream of an Iran without executions or torture. Sixth, autonomy for different ethnic groups but within national unity. Seventh, a free economy, but with support for, the deprived sectors, low-income people. Eighth, a non-nuclear Iran. Peace, rejecting WMDs. Ninth, focus on a healthy, sustainable environment. And 10th, peaceful coexistence with neighbors, with the international community. So yeah, pretty detailed.
That is a very detailed vision for a potential future Iran based on this source. But let's shift gears a bit, because the source, this interview, also has a very sharp, very critical take on Reza Pahlavi, or RPE, as it sometimes refers to him. It talks about his recent actions, placing ads on Iran International, trying to recruit IRGC and Basij members.
That's the paramilitary militia.
That's right, the Basij. And it mentions him reportedly appealing to the UK after, as the source puts it, being ejected from Israel and the US. What does the interview claim is going on here? What's his role, according to this source?
Well, the source frames these actions by going back to a principle from Khomeini. Preservation of the system is the most urgent of obligations. It argues the regime has always used different tactics to survive, like trying to co-opt the MEK early on, which they refused, then massacres, constant demonization campaigns, and even creating what the source calls fake reformists. It points to the Khatami movement as an example, claiming it basically bought the regime another 20 years.
Okay, so the regime trying to preserve itself, how does RPE fit into that picture, according to the source?
The assessment in the source is, frankly, quite critical. It suggests RPE is being raised. That's the term used by the regime. Raised as a kind of reactionary colonial figure. Why? To throw dust in the eyes of the masses, basically. To distract and downplay the actual resistance. It describes his family's history from this viewpoint as being foreign puppets, brought in and kicked out by outside powers. The source even claims that certain figures inside Iran, like Hasham Kastar, he's an imprisoned teacher representative, were apparently told by regime agents to support RPE. It also points to the 2022 Masa Amini protests. According to the source, when things got more radical, RPE told people to go home, suggesting he actively worked to derail the revolution, helped by, it claims, 11 TV channels like Manoto and Iran International. The source doesn't mince words. It calls RPE a mercenary and claims he's connected to the intelligence ministry. It asserts he lacks any real social base inside Iran or genuine backing from foreign governments. Unlike the resistance, which the source says has documented international support, he talks about smoke and mirrors around his public appearances, like renting a room in the UK Parliament, making false claims about UN appearances. All contrasted, the source says, with a lack of real official diplomatic support. So the bottom line, according to this source, RPE's actions ultimately serve to frustrate and disappoint the struggle. He fulfills a role that actually prevents genuine regime overthrow. The source even notes RPE's own reported words like, "I don't want to go to Iran," and says his focus seems to be on fundraising.
That is definitely a starkly different portrayal of RPE than you often hear presented. So, okay, if that's the source's view on RPE's role and his lack of a real base, how does it then describe the Iranian resistance's own claimed social base? How does this interview say the resistance measures its support inside Iran, especially as a contrast to RPE?
Right. The source basically argues that the resistance's strategy relying on the people themselves is gaining traction. It's working from their perspective. It even notes that some Western governments, which were maybe initially hesitant about regime overthrow, are reportedly starting to admit, well, that dealing with the current regime just isn't sustainable long term. The source quotes a past statement attributed to a U.S. president. "We are not seeking regime change, but if the Iranian people want it, why not?" Kind of an interesting aside there.
So, beyond that, what are the tangible signs? What does the source point to as evidence of this social base for the resistance?
It details several indicators it sees as concrete proof. First off, the rebellious units, the Kanuni Shiroshi. These were initiated by Mohammad Gharaee back in 2013. The idea was 1,000 Ashrafs. Like, Ashraf was the MEK's main base in Iraq, so this means thousands of decentralized resistance cells inside Iran. The source claims these units are now widespread. Thousands of operations reported just in March 2025. And it notes that the regime itself acknowledges their existence. Thousands were arrested in 2022. The resistance says over 306 of their network members were among them. Second, prisoners. Despite intense repression, the source says prisoners inside Iran keep chanting resistance slogans. Third, those public slogans we talked about earlier. Death to the dictator, death to Khamenei, death to oppressor, be it Shah or leader. Neither government nor parliament care for the people. These are seen as direct reflections of popular sentiment aligning with the resistance's goals. Fourth, the source argues you should look at the regime's own actions. Its intense focus on fighting the MEK, apparently dedicating 13 or 14 ministries just to counter them, the constant demonization using terms like manifekin. The source argues this proves the regime sees the MEK as its main threat, which implies the resistance must have a significant social base for the regime to be so concerned. Fifth, the nuclear program exposures. The source asserts the MEK revealed the regime's secret nuclear activities 134 times. It claims this made humanity indebted and basically forced the West to deal with the nuclear issue. And finally, just individual acts of defiance, like that woman in Gonesh village standing up to armed forces, or the case of Ali Younisi, a recognized scholar, his arrest, torture, abduction by the regime, despite international outcry. The source says this shows the regime's fear, even of non-violent resistance connected to this movement.
It's clear the source presents a case for a strong internal foundation for the resistance, built on these units, slogans, and acts of defiance. Now, obviously, the regime is still in power today, but looking ahead is important. The interview mentions a specific transition plan, a 6-month period after a constituent assembly is formed, and a commitment by the resistance to step aside if they don't get enough votes. So what guarantees for democracy does the source offer if the resistance were to come to power?
Well, the source argues that the resistance's track record itself, 45, 46 years of struggle, demonstrates its commitment to democratic principles. It even points to their internal structure as evidence. For instance, within the NCRI coalition, the MEK itself apparently only holds one vote, same as a small literary group might have. This, the source suggests, shows a deep-seated pluralism already practiced within the organization. There's also a quote attributed to Mohammad Gharaee. A journalist once asked him about guarantees for democracy, and he reportedly replied, "The guarantee is the people themselves." The source really emphasizes this point. The Iranian people, having lived through both the Shah's dictatorship and the mullah's rule, simply won't let any new power become dictatorial. The process described involves those local rebellious units, city committees, all built from the ground up by the people.
So the ultimate guarantee is the people's vigilance, learned through hard experience.
That's a big part of it, according to the source. That experience, combined with the pluralism, they say, is practiced internally within the NCRI.
Right.
That's what will lead to a democratic future. And a key specific guarantee mentioned is right there in the 10-point plan. The freedom of parties.
Mm-hmm.
The idea is this ensures that even if some group wanted to grab absolute power, the structures of a multi-party system supported by an organized and experienced populace would prevent it. The groundwork for that pluralism, the source argues, is already being laid within Iranian society by the resistance.
This has been really insightful, a deep dive into Mohammad Gharaee's perspective for sure. We've talked through what the source presents as this unique strategy, the third solution. We explored the evidence it puts forward for the Iranian people's desire for real fundamental change. We unpacked the very complex and critical view this source has on figures like Reza Pahlavi, and examined the concrete groundwork the Iranian resistance claims it's laying inside Iran.
Yeah, and maybe a final thought for you to consider drawing from all this. What's striking is how the history of Iran, at least it's presented here, seems to suggest something powerful. That the will of a people, once it's truly awake, once it's organized, well, just can't be held down forever. Yeah. And that genuine lasting change, it really has to bubble up from within, from the people themselves, not from outside pressure or, false promises from those trying to keep things the same. Something to think about.
Absolutely. A powerful thought to end on. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these critical issues on your own.
دریا شد